In the heart of the Spanish Empire, a prince screamed behind locked doors, not from enemies nor from traitors, but from his own blood. Don Carlos of Spain, heir to a global throne, was sealed inside a stone chamber by the one man meant to protect him, his father, King Philip II. There were no trials, no funeral, only silence, and the slow, unspeakable rot of a royal mind and body. Centuries later, the walls still whisper what the crown tried to bury. Watch until the end to uncover the grotesque truth Spain never wanted the world to know. But before we unlock the door to this forgotten prison, click like and subscribe to join history's hidden horrors, where the past never rests in peace. The royal cradle held not a boy, but a curse forged by incest. He came into the world screaming, not because he was alive, but because something was already wrong. The midwives looked at his misshapen skull, his lopsided limbs, the strange stillness in his eyes, and said nothing. Not in front of the court, not under the eyes of God and empire. Don Carlos was born in 1545 in the cold echoing chambers of Valladolid. His mother, Maria Manuela of Portugal, barely 17, died 4 days later. Torn apart by childbirth, burning with fever, she whispered prayers in her native tongue while her body collapsed from within. Her son cost her everything, but she had never truly left him. Her blood and the blood of their shared ancestors lived on in him like a curse. Carlos was the product of a royal experiment gone too far. His parents weren't just cousins. Their fathers were brothers. Their mothers were sisters. The Habsburgs had been breeding themselves into a corner for generations, folding the family tree inward until it became a noose. Most people have 16 great-great-grandparents. Carlos had 6. The rest had been erased by repetition, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, all in the name of purity. And the cost was printed in flesh. He was an infant, but already wrong. His skull bulged unevenly, like soft fruit ripening on only one side. One eye slightly lower than the other, his left leg shorter by inches. The court celebrated his birth as divine, while the palace physicians exchanged glances that said otherwise. They knew what the nobles refused to see. This boy wasn't a blessing. He was a warning. As he grew, the symptoms multiplied. He could not feed properly. His chest did not expand when he breathed, it sank, compressing his lungs. Sometimes he would stop breathing altogether, his lips turning blue, his body twitching. Then suddenly he'd gasp like a drowning man breaking the surface. One nurse fainted the first time she saw it, but still the empire demanded celebration. Portraits were painted. Poets wrote verses. They called him El Deseado, the desired one. But behind closed doors, the court whispered. The emperor's grandson looked more like a broken statue than a child. And statues don't grow. They crack. He was wrapped in silk, kissed by bishops, watched over by generals, all of them praying that whatever flaw was growing in him would vanish with age. But it didn't. The palace's finest armorers would later struggle to shape metal to fit his ribs. Tailors would stitch royal robes to hide the curve of his spine, and sculptors would position his portraits carefully, always from the left side. The world saw the golden heir to the Spanish crown, but the boy beneath the velvet already carried the rot. His mother's death had been only the first blood sacrifice, and soon the kingdom would bleed for him too. They forged him armor, but the shape of his bones refused destiny. At 13, Don Carlos stood in the royal armory of Madrid, half naked under torchlight, while the court armorer fought to fit him into steel. The breastplate forged from the finest Milanese metal engraved with the imperial seal would not close. No matter how they bent it, no matter how they hammered, it would not fit. Carlos stood silent, chest heaving. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, not from effort, but from anatomy. His chest was malformed, sunken on one side, caved in just beneath the ribs. The armor pressed against his lungs like a hand over his mouth. Every breath was a battle, every inhale a wheeze. But he didn't speak. He never did when they tried to fit him like a king. He just watched. Pale stiff as if daring them to say it aloud, the prince was broken. His right shoulder sat nearly 2 inches higher than the left. His legs mismatched in length gave him an unnatural tilt. The armorer whispered apologies, but Carlos did not respond. Instead, he raised his arms as instructed and let the man try again. For the Habsburg, symmetry was theology. The king's body was a metaphor, a mirror of divine order. Straight spine, square shoulders, noble brow. These were not just signs of health, but signs of heaven's approval. And Carlos, heir to the greatest Catholic empire on earth, was failing that test with every breath he took. The court adjusted. Painfully. Palace portraits were staged with strategic angles. Shadows fell carefully across his jaw, hiding the infamous Habsburg chin that protruded grotesquely from his narrow face. Paintings tilted his posture upright, erased the bulge in his skull, evened his eyes. He was still called beautiful in official dispatches. The illusion was necessary, but illusions crack, especially when the prince moved. The clicking of his uneven gait echoed through marble halls, one foot dragging the other thudding, a rhythm that courtiers began to recognize and avoid. Servants learned to stand still when he passed, heads bowed, mouths shut. Carlos hated noise. He hated laughter more. He would freeze mid-step if he heard it. Turn his head. Wait. And no one ever laughed again. Behind closed doors, the treatments began. They bled him weakly to balance his humors. They dunked him in mercury baths to soften the bone. They constructed iron boots designed to force his shorter leg to stretch. The metal chewed into his flesh. When removed at night, the servants could hear him scream. The echoes slipped under doors like smoke. But it wasn't just his body that betrayed him. It was the rage. The white-hot, uncontrollable fury that came without warning, ignited by the smallest things: a dropped tray, a crooked button, a glance held too long. He threw objects, cursed in Latin, bit his own arm until it bled. Once he locked a servant in his chambers and refused to let her leave until she recited the Lord's Prayer backwards. Still the tutors came. The diplomats bowed. The kingdom prepared. He would be king one day. The empire demanded it. But in the private reports to the king, the truth leaked through. His constitution is delicate, they wrote. His attention, volatile. They did not dare describe the breathing, the screaming, the boots. Instead, they used code delicate, nervous, sensitive, as if the words themselves might trigger the boy into another fit. And through it all, Carlos watched. He wasn't stupid. He knew what they were doing, knew how they dressed him, painted him, arranged him like a corpse that refused to lie flat. He knew his body repulsed them, that his silence frightened them more than his screams. And so he cultivated it. The quiet menace, the stare that lingered too long, the smile that curled upward at all the wrong times. He was a prince who could not ride, could not fight, could not breathe without effort. And yet one day, he would wear the crown. That was the promise, that was the threat. He laughed as he fed boots to a shoemaker. By 17, Don Carlos had learned the power of stillness. He could enter a room and drain it of oxygen without speaking a word. He walked, or rather lurched, through corridors like a living omen. His foot scraped the floor. His breath wheezed behind his teeth. His eyes, unfocused and bloodshot, drifted across faces as if searching for something already dead. The palace feared him, not because he was loud, but because he was patient, because cruelty in him arrived in silence. The incident with the shoemaker began innocently. The man had labored for weeks crafting custom boots to accommodate the prince's warped legs. But when Carlos tried them on the left, one pinched barely. Just a fraction of discomfort. Enough to awaken the rot that lived just beneath his skin. "Eat them," Carlos said softly. The shoemaker laughed, nervously, stupidly. But Carlos didn't. Cut them and eat. The silence was absolute. Courtiers froze. A servant dropped a goblet. The sound echoed like a shot. With trembling hands, the man drew his knife, sliced the leather. Piece by piece he chewed, swallowed, eyes watering. Carlos watched, calm, smiling. His lips parted slightly, as if savoring not the act, but the obedience. This was no tantrum, no childish outburst. This was performance, power refined and theatrical. And it was not the first time. Rumors multiplied. Servants whispered of animals found burned in his fireplace, their small blackened bodies arranged in patterned symbols no one dared interpret. A page boy who mocked Carlos's limp woke one night to find the prince looming over his bed, holding a fire poker glowing orange. The boy escaped only because Carlos lost balance mid-swing. The rug saved his life. But even more terrifying than his violence was his selectivity. Carlos never harmed the powerful. Nobles were greeted with tense civility. Diplomats saw flashes of charm. It was only those without status, the invisible, the disposable, who bore his full attention. This wasn't madness. It was hierarchy. Still, the court excused it. His bloodline was sacred. His mother had died birthing him. His skull was misshapen from infancy. His rage, they said, was physical pressure on the brain. Bad humors, misaligned stars, anything but evil. Behind closed doors, the physicians debated. They examined the bulge on the left side of his skull, the tremors in his hands, the migraines that left him screaming into stone walls. They offered treatments soaked in desperation, leeches, tonics, prayers in Latin. Nothing worked. Sometimes he'd grow calm for days, only to erupt over nothing, a dish too hot a glance, too long a draught, too cold. And then came Elizabeth, the French princess, the promised bride, only not for him. Carlos had been betrothed to her by treaty. For months he pored over her portrait, that oval face, those narrow eyes, the gentle tilt of her mouth. He memorized every line. She would be his redemption, his claim to legitimacy, to beauty, to love. But Philip, his father, changed everything. The king married her himself. Carlos attended the wedding in garments stitched to conceal deformity, his hair combed to hide the asymmetry of his skull. He watched as Elizabeth swore vows meant for him, watched as his father placed a ring on her finger, and smiled. That same terrible smile. He left her gifts, dead birds arranged in spirals, braids of his own hair bound in blood-red silk. A portrait of Elizabeth defaced his father's image, scratched out, replaced crudely by his own. When questioned, he denied everything. But Elizabeth began locking her doors at night. Her kindness only made it worse. She called him dear cousin, included him at court dinners, laughed politely at his stiff jokes. But her pity was acid. Every smile, a knife. Every glance, a mirror. He began to haunt her. She walked in the gardens. He followed. She rode in the courtyard. He stood at the window. She prayed. He listened. The footfall of his dragging leg became a sound of dread. The courtiers whispered, "The prince is hunting again." At a masked ball, Carlos approached her, drunk, masked, emboldened. He leaned in, whispered something no one could hear. Her face went pale. She fled. From that moment on, she was never alone with him again. Whatever he said ended something. That night, Carlos broke a mirror in his chambers, not with rage, but precision. Each shard arranged in a circle around his bed, as if awaiting something holy or something final. His body withered. His mind bloomed into madness. It was a servant girl who triggered the fall. She hadn't meant to look, hadn't meant to gasp. But when she saw the prince without his special boots, the way his foot twisted grotesquely, the raw bone pressing against pale skin, the sound escaped her. Soft, involuntary, but fatal. Carlos saw her and chased her. Down the servant's staircase, his uneven legs thudding and scraping. His left foot dragged. His stronger leg overcompensated. The narrow stone steps bent sharply downward. Gravity seized him like a predator. For a moment, his body hung in the air, arms flailing mouth open, and then collapsed against the marble like a sack of meat. The crack of his skull on stone echoed through the castle like a bell tolling doom. He didn't die, but something inside him did. For 3 days, he lay unconscious. Blood pooled behind his eyes. Fluid dripped from his ears. His breathing came in gasps, wet and mechanical. Physicians gathered in whispering circles offering prayers and medieval guesses. Leeches boiled beetles' Hebrew incantations. Nothing worked. Then one suggested a trepanation. They would drill through the skull. Let the pressure escape. It was a death sentence disguised as hope. But Philip said yes. The surgery happened at midnight when the moon hung like a sickle above the palace. 2 strong men pinned Carlos down. The drill bit into bone with a scream that wasn't his, not yet. But halfway through, his eyes opened, wide, silent, and he did not blink. He didn't scream, just stared at the ceiling, lips moving in a language no one recognized. When the skull cracked open, the pressure released with a wet pop. They inserted a silver tube to keep it draining. Carlos lay like a puppet with its strings cut, trembling, pale, vacant. And then he woke. For a moment there was clarity. He spoke, ate, even smiled. The court rejoiced, but the Carlos who woke was not the Carlos who fell. He began writing lists, names of enemies, servants, courtiers, names crossed out in red, detailed plans for how he would punish them when crowned. Some he would boil, others flayed, one bricked inside a wall. He demanded guards test his food, made them taste each bite, poured wine onto polished floors to see if it frothed sure sign of poison, slept with daggers under his pillow, hid letters in floorboards, told his servants to speak only in whispers. The walls were listening. And worst of all, he began speaking of the king. "My father is not the rightful ruler," he said. God has turned his face. He asked visiting nobles strange questions. If a prince rose against his father, would your nation recognize him? How did France handle mad kings? Has your queen ever poisoned her husband? The court dismissed it as paranoia, but Philip did not. And so the tower was prepared. A private suite, they said. A retreat for recovery. But the door locked from the outside. The windows barred with iron. Guards stood at attention, but never spoke. They were not to interfere, only observe. Inside, Carlos unraveled. He refused to bathe, convinced the water was cursed. Refused food unless it was brought by specific hands. He scratched patterns into the stone walls with his nails. He set places at the dinner table for invisible guests, his dead mother. Kings long buried. Other versions of himself. He urinated in corners, claiming servants used his waste in black magic. Sores bloomed along his scalp, oozing fluid. His skin peeled in sheets. His breath stank of rot. But still he dragged himself across the cold floor, proud, refusing help, leaving trails of blood behind. His obsession turned to ice. He demanded buckets of it constantly, drank it, bathed in it, poured it over his skull. The physicians who weren't allowed to treat him speculated he was trying to freeze the fire in his brain. 6 months passed. The smell reached the halls before he did. Guards reported strange noises, screams that became lullabies, laughter at nothing. The words he muttered made no sense, not in Latin, not in Spanish. But sometimes they heard one phrase again and again, spoken clearly. "I am rotting and they are letting me rot." And they were. Every day Philip read reports. Every sore, every scream, every hallucination catalogued and filed. He did nothing. No healers sent. No letters returned. Just silence, the kind that seals tombs. When the king knocked, it wasn't to forgive. January 18th, 1568. The castle held its breath. In a dark antechamber, King Philip II fastened his armor, not the ceremonial kind, but full battle gear. Steel plates clinked as aides cinched leather straps. No trumpet sounded. No banner waved. There was no enemy at the gates, except the one inside, his son. Don Carlos, heir to the Spanish Empire, had done the unthinkable. In his madness, or perhaps in his clarity, he had revealed a plan. He would escape the castle, flee to the Netherlands, join the rebels, raise an army, return not as prince but as liberator, as the rightful king. He had drawn maps, hidden weapons, bribed guards, composed letters to foreign enemies. Philip knew everything. One of Carlos's trusted men had been his spy. Now there was no decision left to make. The armor wasn't for protection, it was ritual. The king had come to bury the father. He walked the halls slowly, every step deliberate. The stone beneath him echoed heavy with the weight of extinction. His shadow stretched ahead like an omen. Outside the prince's door, the guards stood stiff. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Everyone knew what was happening. The key turned. Inside, Carlos was awake, sitting on the floor, surrounded by melted ice, old food hair clumps, and blood. His skin sagged. His legs were wasted. His eyes somehow were clear. He looked at the figure in the doorway. Some say he smiled. Others say he wept. Neither would have changed what followed. Philip gave the order. The guards entered. Carlos did not resist. They bound his wrists thin as bone. As they lifted him to his feet, he shivered not from cold, but from the weight of being seen. Perhaps he thought this moment would be different, that his father had come with forgiveness. But Philip wore steel, not robes, and steel does not embrace. From that night forward, Don Carlos ceased to exist. He was moved deeper into the castle. Not to a dungeon, but a different kind of grave. A royal suite converted into a cell. The windows were sealed with mortar, the fireplace extinguished. The locks turned quietly. Outside, the Empire whispered. Inside, he deteriorated. Servants delivered food and ice by hatch. They no longer looked him in the eye. One reported he spoke to his chamber pot. Another said he cried for hours, then laughed for days. Philip received daily reports, but gave no response. His decision had already been made, and his punishment was not death. It was time. The prince's final months were grotesque theater. He stopped walking entirely. His muscles collapsed. His spine arched unnaturally like a sickle under the weight of stillness. He dragged himself with raw hands, fingers worn to the bone. Letters found in his cell, unsent, unspeakable, alternated between apologies and death threats. Some addressed to his father, others to God. And then came the final fever. In late July, a servant found him unconscious in a pool of ice water. His lips were blue, his breathing shallow. His skin, once flushed with rage, had taken on the pale translucence of something already gone. He died the next day. No bells rang. No court announcement followed. The official story was natural illness. There was no funeral procession, no lying in state. His body was buried quickly, quietly. His tomb bore only a name. No titles, no inscription. The erasure began before his corpse cooled. Servants entered his cell under royal order. They burned his belongings, sliced up portraits, scrubbed walls. Letters were destroyed, journals torched. His name was struck from court records. Chronicles skipped over his life as if it had never happened. Even the room itself, that echoing prison of decay, was sealed behind stone. And Philip he returned to governance. No public mourning, no mention of his son. The empire moved on unshaken, as if the heir had been nothing more than a bad dream. But silence is not the same as peace. Behind every locked door, someone remembered. The guards, the scribes, the servants who brought him ice and watched him rot. And among those who knew one phrase remained. Not screamed, not spoken, whispered. He wore armor to arrest his own son. They erased his name, but not the stench of what they did. The story should have ended there. A prince rotting in isolation, buried in a nameless tomb, forgotten by the court, that once called him the Desired. That was the plan. Philip's final act of power wasn't imprisonment, but erasure. He didn't just kill his son, he tried to delete him. But history doesn't rot like flesh, it ferments. For over 2 centuries, Spain kept Don Carlos hidden in the footnotes, a sickly heir, a young prince who died before his time. The cause of death was never officially corrected. There were no monuments, no elegies, no whispered legends. He was not even a cautionary tale until the enemies of Spain began to sing his name. In 1787, Friedrich Schiller, a German playwright, stumbled across fragments of the prince's life. The sealed tower, the madness, the silent father. But Schiller saw no monster. He saw a martyr, a beautiful broken youth destroyed by tyranny. His play Don Carlos portrayed the prince as a tragic idealist, a voice of liberty, crushed by the cold machine of monarchy. And then came Verdi. The Italian composer transformed Schiller's play into an opera. Audiences wept as Don Carlo mourned the loss of his bride, defied his father, and embraced death for love and honor. The real Carlos, the boy who made shoemakers eat leather, who burned rabbits alive, who whispered violence into the dark, was gone. Replaced by music, the irony was perfect. Philip had won every battle. He silenced a dangerous heir, preserved his empire, controlled the narrative, but in doing so, he created a vacuum. A silence so vast it begged to be filled. And into that void, the artists came turning madness into poetry, cruelty into pathos. The monster became a saint, the prison became a stage, the screams became arias, and yet, something of the truth still clings to the ruins. In the corners of Spanish history, whispers remain. Of a sealed chamber that still reeks in summer. Of servants who had nightmares long after their pensioned exile. Of paintings with faces scraped away. Of guards who swore they heard footsteps long after Carlos died, that familiar dragging limp echoing down empty stone halls. And then there is the lesson, not of madness nor mercy nor monarchy, but of memory. History is not written in ink. It is carved in silence, edited by those who survive. Power does not only destroy the body, it erases the evidence. It burns letters, seals rooms, forces silence into every witness until the past is no longer rotten, just missing. Philip II did not kill his son with poison or sword. He killed him with time, with silence, with the deliberate withholding of acknowledgement. But ghosts don't stay buried. Don Carlos, twisted in flesh and mind, was not a hero. But he was real. And in the end, that reality matters more than the operas, the stage lights, the sympathetic rewrites. Because it reveals what courts can do when legacy matters more than truth. When fathers choose power over love. When kings wear armor not to protect a kingdom, but to imprison their own blood. So what remains? Not a prince, not a legacy, just a castle. And the room no one enters anymore,